Historian Robert Kagan has been writing about foreign affairs for most of his 64 years. The first book in his planned trilogy on the American foreign policy was published in 2006 and focused on U.S. history before the founding up to the Spanish-American War. Kagan, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, has just completed the second book in the trilogy, titled The Ghost at the Feast, America and the Collapse of World Order 1900 to 1941. Robert Kagan, in conclusion, writes, Americans have complex attitudes toward power and morality. They have a sense of distinctiveness and remoteness and a tumultuous and highly contested political system. Bob Kagan, what impact did Abraham Lincoln's assassination, Garfield's assassination, and McKinley's assassination have on this country when you started writing about 1900? What was the residual after those three assassinations of presidents?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I don't know what to say about the Garfield assassination. I know that had something to do with arguments over government reform and patronage and things like that. In Lincoln's case, obviously the United States was still suffering from the fact that Lincoln was not able to carry out the kind of reconstruction efforts that I think he wanted to do vis-a-vis the South. And so the South basically broke out of Reconstruction and went back to Jim Crow and other things. I think if Lincoln had been allowed to finish his second term, things might have been very different. So we were dealing at the end of the 19th century with an America that was, it was a big issue in the world, for instance, that there were so many lynchings in America. I remember Theodore Roosevelt had to respond to when he was president, a lot of criticism about all the lynching. And he had Grover Washington come to the White House. And it's not Grover Washington. Who am I talking about? Grover Washington is a saxophone player. Anyway, Booker T. Washington. Sorry, all my Washington's confused up. Anyway, so that was a big issue. The assassination of McKinley is obviously, from the purposes of this book, extremely important because he was the person who basically led the United States into the intervention in Cuba, which then led to the sort of accidental acquisition of the Philippines, which he presided over. And he presided over it very successfully. I mean, he was extremely popular. His re-election showed that the country felt that he was leading the country well. And then his assassination left people worried about who his vice president was. Roosevelt was thought to be a bit of a loose cannon, and people wondered. And then, as it turns out, he conducted a very stable, including on foreign policy, a very sort of stabilizing and calm foreign policy, and fooled people. But the loss of McKinley at that moment was potentially a big issue, which I think Roosevelt handled very well.
I probably didn't ask the question very well because what I was really that was important what you were just saying. But what I was really looking for is what you thought the impact was on the psyche of the United States that we were having presidents killed. And then it went on, of course, to JFK.
Right. I mean, I don't know how much the McKinley assassination was particularly upsetting because it was for Americans, for a certain kind of American at least, because it was carried out by someone whose name they could not possibly pronounce. And I don't even, not sure I know, but it was a Southeastern European, and it was an anarchist. And there was a great deal of anarchists at that time were killing off numerous world leaders, not just in the United States, but also in Europe. And so there was a big panic about that at the time. But I'd have to say Americans seem to recover pretty quickly from these events, and I don't think for instance, the McKinley assassination lingered as a major factor in American behavior after that.
I saw somewhere, and I don't know where, that they called your book revisionist history. First of all, is it revisionist history, and what does that mean?
I don't know who called it revisionist history. I think there are elements of this book which run contrary to what I think most people think, and that may start, for instance, with the Spanish-American War. Most historians treat that as the opening of American imperialism, and I don't think that imperial motives were actually involved in the decision to intervene in Cuba. I think those are humanitarian issues. And so, yeah.
How long was that Spanish-American War in 1898?
1898, it basically, well, the Cuban part of the Spanish-American War lasts only a few months. I mean, it basically is over within a few months. That's why, John Hay famously called it a splendid little war. By the way, he didn't mean it was splendid because it was great to have war. It was how quickly it went and how painlessly, relatively speaking. But then the unexpected conflict in the Philippines lasts until 1902. So there's basically 4 years of fighting in the Philippines, in which Americans lost roughly 4,000 soldiers, which is equivalent to what we lost in Iraq over 10 years. So if you think about it, it was a much more telescoped conflict and very controversial at the time.
This is the second book in a trilogy, supposedly.
Right.
When did you decide to do a trilogy, and what is the scope of it?
Well, this is the thing that happened to me in general. I initially thought I would write a one-volume history of American foreign policy. It soon became clear to me that I couldn't say everything I thought needed to be said in one volume, so I was going to write 2 volumes. And ultimately, I actually think it needs 4 volumes, but I'm not sure I'm going to live long enough to write 4. So I have 3 at least in mind. And the third volume will be from the outbreak of World War II to sometime after the end of the Cold War, the 90s or something like that.
What did the first volume cover?
The first volume covered basically from 1607 to 1898. So the first 2 centuries where, American foreign policy is not, I could do it in that amount of space because American foreign policy is not quite as active as it then becomes at the turn of the century.
As you know, that first book was 2006. You've even written other books since then. How do you operate? How do you work? How do you set it up that you can keep track of all this history?
Yeah, it's, this book, the one we're talking about now, The Ghost at the Feast, I lie and say it took me 12 years. I think it probably took me 15 years. And it's partly because I take time out occasionally to write another short book, as you say. But partly I really feel like I don't just go back and write what I think I already know. I really go through a very extensive research process and allow myself to be disabused of things that I thought were true and to then discover new things. And so, and that may be why it's revisionist, in what people call it revisionist, because I do think I have a different take on what we were talking about, the Spanish-American War. I have a different take on the American policy in the 1920s than I think most historians. But basically, I try to just submerge myself in that period and try to see the world from their point of view. And that's the thing I think that is most important in history. We judge history backwards, but we live it forwards. And I want to try to give the impression in the history of what it's like to live it forward.
On page 220, this jumped out at me. Indeed, it is the contention of this book that the United States had it within its power to preserve the peace in Europe after 1919, and at manageable cost, but for reasons having little to do with capacity, Washington policymakers would not take the steps necessary.
Yeah, I think and that may be one of the more revisionist aspects of this book, but I think that is, that's one of the 2 major points I would like people to come away with, which is that there was an opportunity to have a relatively peaceful liberal world of the kind that we have now with much less effort by the United States. Because in 1919, the United States was even more powerful relative to the rest of the world than it was after World War II. People tend to think that World War II is when the United States became the superpower. But at the end of World War I, the United States had the largest economy, larger than all the rest of the major economies put together. The United States not only did not suffer from World War I, except for the loss of about 100,000 soldiers, which was a major, but not compared to what happened in Europe, where people lost tens of millions. But also the United States profited immensely from the war. So the United States emerged from the war with all the money in the world, effectively, and everybody owed the United States money. In addition to which, the United States, from a standing start, we had probably about 20,000 troops at the beginning. When World War I broke out, we wound up putting 4 million men under arms, which completely shifted the balance of power in Europe. So the United States had the capacity at that time. Opponents of the liberal world that we favor were on their backs. The Russians were involved in the Bolshevik Revolution and Civil War. They were completely out of Europe, defeated by Germany. The Germans then were flat on their back, obviously, without even a military. Japan at that time was very accommodating to the new American order in that early period, believe it or not. And then so who were the powerful countries? Democratic Britain, Democratic France, both of whom wanted the United States to stay involved. So it was a very accommodating period, actually, for the United States to do what it ultimately did after World War II, at much greater cost, with many more troops deployed overseas, etc.
I was watching you address another audience, and it was interesting when you told them, I'm about to tell you something that you don't know, or maybe somebody in this audience might know. And this was an intellectual group.
Yeah.
And you started telling them about the Ruhr Valley, R-U-H-R,
right.
Incident in the 1923, I believe it was, in Germany. And most of them, I don't know what they said to you afterwards, but what is that story and why don't people know about it?
Yeah, it's one of the, when I was reading other accounts of this period, Dean Acheson, writing in the 1930s, looks back at the French invasion of the Ruhr district of Germany in 1923 as a turning point in the history, and which led to the radicalism of Germany, the rise of Hitler, the hyperinflation that we always talk about in Germany. How did it happen? Well, under Versailles, Germany was supposed to be shipping regular reparations, whether in the form of money or in kind. And the Germans were always highly reluctant to do it. They didn't think they had enough to give it. But in any case, you can imagine the German public didn't like taking whatever money they had and giving it to foreign governments, even if it was reparations for a war that they themselves don't feel that they were responsible for. So getting the Germans to pay was difficult. And under Versailles, there were punitive measures that France could carry out. And because the United States absented itself from the Versailles Treaty, which would have given it the authority to prevent the French from doing this, the French had nobody standing in their way. And so the French invade the Ruhr in order to take over coal mines and steel factories in order to get the production that the Germans owed them for reparations. But the consequence of that, as one can imagine, is that the Germans were sent into a kind of radical fury over this invasion and really never recovered from it. The Nazi Party numbers in this period jump dramatically, and to some extent, Germany never recovers from that. And that was something the Americans could have prevented. The French, the Germans, and the British were all begging the United States to get involved and to help arrive at a solution to this. But the antipathy to involvement in Europe after World War I was so great that the Harding administration told diplomats not to attend international meetings. And so the United States really did stand by, and this catastrophe that is, as you say, that no one remembers occurred. And that's the part of this history that I'd like to recapture, because one core thesis, which I think it goes beyond this book in general, is that by the time you get to the 1930s, the disaster has already occurred. It's too late then. The real mistakes that led to the 1930s were made in the 1920s, and it's often during periods of seeming calm that the mistakes are made, which then lead to the breakdown of order later on.
Go back to that incident, and how long did it last? The Belgians were involved in it. How many were people killed during that when the French?
Yeah, there was some resistance by the German workers who didn't want to be working at the point of a French gun, and giving whatever they were producing to France, and so there was some killing in that respect. But there was also real oppression. Reinhold Niebuhr, who was the great philosopher of the time, he was a young man. He was an American, but he was of German ancestry, and his parents were born in Germany, and he went to visit their home and found just utter devastation. I don't think people quite realize the degree to which that Ruhr intervention really caused enormous suffering among the German people. And so one of the things that happened was the Germans, they had to pay the workers not to work, because they were resisting this French occupation. In order to pay them, they just printed more currency, and that produced the hyperinflation where people were walking around with barrels of money in order to pay the grocer.
How much did Germany owe to the rest of the world?
Well, the reparations payment were set at they were going to have to pay a few $100 million a year until 1988. That was the terms, because the debts that the French and the British owed the United States were also going to be paid off by 1988. And so the French took the position that they were not going to pay $1 more to the Americans than they could get from the Germans. And so the more the French needed to be paying back, the more you were gouging the Germans of whatever money they were able to make. And that just proved to be a disaster. And by the way, American officials knew it was a mistake to insist that the Europeans pay back all their war debts. That's another interesting question. You know, when the United States first, at the beginning of World War I, when the United States entered the war, and the Congress, the first thing they did was loan billions of dollars to the French and British. Congressmen at the time felt, we don't even care if we get paid back, because what we're basically doing is sending dollars, not American soldiers, to fight this war. But of course, when the war was over, that was forgotten. And then they said, well, where's our money? And President Coolidge famously said, well, they hired the money, didn't they? So they need to pay it back, which was very short-sighted on our part.
Here's a quote, Woodrow Wilson running for his second term. This was in 1916, right before the election. "It is a war with which we have nothing to do, whose causes cannot touch us." And of course, as you write in your book, his slogan that year was, "He kept us out of war." So this isn't the first time or the last time the presidents told us they weren't going to war. What's your reaction to what he was doing then?
Well, he was quite sincerely trying to keep Americans out of the war. He was not pulling the wool over their eyes. He desperately wanted to keep the United States out of the war, even though he was worried about Germany. But he felt that the American people did not want to go to war, and that was what opinion showed. And so it's only after the Germans renew all-out submarine warfare against all shipping in the Atlantic, and then begin sinking American-flagged ships. And then also there is the wonderful Zimmerman telegram, which comes out in February of 1917, in which the German foreign ministry is talking to Mexican officials about taking back Texas and part of Southwest America, and this got Americans riled up too, to the point where everybody decided that Germany was just incorrigible and that there was no choice but to go to war. But it is interesting that almost not much more than 5 months after declaring that, we're not going to get into the war, he goes to Congress, calls for getting into the war to enormous support. And that's the fickleness of American public opinion, I think, is something that we're all aware of. And in foreign policy, I think it's understandable, and let me end on this point, which is when he said that nothing there can touch us, he was not wrong. And this is one of the great sort of paradoxes and conundrums of American foreign policy, which is Americans have been, at least since the beginning of the 20th century, essentially invulnerable to foreign invasion. Obviously, you can launch a terrorist attack or you can bomb Pearl Harbor, but to invade and really defeat the United States is impossible. So whenever Americans do get involved in the world, they have to say, why are we doing this? We're not doing it. Sometimes they convince themselves that they're doing it out of necessity, but it's never really out of that kind of necessity. It's always being influenced by other factors in our way of thinking. Usually, and in the case of World War I and World War II, the desire not to see liberalism defeated by militaristic authoritarianism overseas.
This question really pertains to whether or not, the view of government in this country is rather low, as it is about the media. But here's some other quotes that I've always wanted to ask a historian like you about. The first one is FDR, and you right up to the start of the Second World War. But here's what he said on October the 30th, again, right before the election. and this would have been his third term. No, it would be
40. Yeah,
40.
40. Yeah.
He said, and while I'm talking to you mothers and fathers, I give you one more assurance. I have said this before, and I'll say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. He had to know in October of 1940 that that could possibly not be true.
I think he knew that that could possibly not be true. And I had to, getting inside Franklin Roosevelt's head is one of the great challenges of all time, because of course he told different things to different people. He kept his cards very close to his vest, and I don't think anybody other than him, maybe his wife, knew what he was really thinking. I come away believing, after doing the research, that he himself hoped it would not be necessary to send American troops overseas, literally send troops overseas. I think he thought America could fulfill what was required of it through the use of its naval power and through the use of being the arsenal of democracy, by producing enough weapons for the others to do the fighting. I think that he did not, until very late, think that he was going to have to actually send forces back across the Atlantic. I think it was George Marshall who said to him, among others probably, that you're not going to be able to do this without sending American forces. But I think probably when he gave that speech, he thought that was true.
Got to give you one more of these.
I love him.
This is LBJ. I know this is beyond the scope of this book. It probably will be in your next. But this is in the fall of 1964, right before his election to his first and only full term. We are not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. We don't want to get tied down to a land war in Asia 550,000 troops later.
Yeah.
What I mean, again, right before the election, right. What's going on here?
Well, as you say, I haven't studied the Vietnam War with the kind of care that I've studied what I've just been writing about, so I'm a little bit reluctant to make a judgment, honestly, based on that. But what I would say is, a little bit goes back to what I was saying before. Because the United States does not respond to things overseas because it's immediately threatened with the attack, naturally, I think Americans would always like to do as little as possible to accomplish their objectives. So if the objective is fundamentally to protect the liberal democratic world from attack or being pushed around by various types of autocracies, in this case communism, which was obviously the number one concern of Americans at the time. Therefore, we'd like to do what we can, but we want to do as little as possible. So our response is always, it's an escalation, because we start by, well, we'll sanction them, or we'll arm the people who are fighting against them and let them do the fighting. But then we're still committed, and even though now they're not succeeding, and therefore we have to do more and more and more. And look at Ukraine today. I mean, we didn't. If you had said to any American, certainly any foreign policy expert, on February 22nd, does the United States have a vital security interest in Ukraine? Everybody would have said, of course not. Even if Ukraine were to fall to Russia, the United States' security is not going to be put at risk. And yet, as soon as the Russians invaded Ukraine, Americans rose up in rather strong fashion. A majority of Americans thought we need to be doing something to help Ukraine. And what we've been doing is gradually ratcheting up our involvement in the war in order to make sure that the Ukrainians don't lose to the Russians. I mean, a lot of this is happening right in front of us right now. This tendency to think we don't care about something, and then, well, it turns out we do care, and then we try to do as little as possible in order to accomplish our objective, and it winds up not being enough. And I actually I call this the America trap, because I think if you look at the 20th century in particular, other great power autocracies have walked into this trap again and again and again. They believe that the United States is true of Germany in both world wars and Japan in World War II. They believe the United States is not interested in doing anything, isn't really capable of doing anything, and certainly isn't going to do anything in time. And so they take their moves and they make their steps, and then they get so far down the road that even when the United States does say, were really going to get involved, it's too late to convince them to turn back around.
So as I'm reading your book, I'm learning about Japan invading Manchuria, and of course in China and Nanking and that whole story. They obviously invaded us. The Germans invaded Poland. And I kept thinking, look what the world's doing today. How are we supposed to make sense out of the fact that we've asked Japan to increase their military output? We've asked the Germans to give tanks and other things, of course, to Ukraine. What's going on in the world, and how can you make sense out of all this?
Well, I mean, partly that's the miracle of that is the miracle of American foreign policy. And, we make a lot of mistakes, and you can't read the history of American foreign policy and think that, we're always the smartest or we do make mistakes. But if you look at the transformation of Germany and Japan from being the real threats to world peace and world order, and now being the bulwarks of world peace and world order and democracy, that's no small accomplishment. And it makes all the difference because, you're right to say, look at the parallel. The names have changed. It's not Germany in Europe now, it's Russia. It's not Japan in Asia, it's China. But the structure of the situation is similar. What's different, if you look back to the 1930s, is that in the 1930s, the United States had no allies, really. Certainly no formal alliances, no deployments overseas. Today, as you see the rise of China and the aggressiveness of Russia, but they're doing it in a world that is heavily dominated by the American-led liberal order, and they face immediate obstacles to their actions, which the Germans in 1930s and the Japanese in 1930s did not face.
I want to ask you about some other things that people might not know about. There's something, and I've seen it over the years, a Kellogg-Briand pact.
Right.
You write about it. What is it?
A lot of people have very idealistic notions about the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Well, what was it? It was an agreement. It was very simple. I think it's a 2-sentence statement about they're going to outlaw war. Everybody who signs it agrees that war is illegal. And there was some theory that if everybody agreed that war was illegal, then you would have less war. I don't know why anybody thought that was true, but the irony is that this idea really came out of American peace activists, and they convinced the French to ask the Americans to sign a kind of a non-aggression pact. The Americans were so hostile to the idea of signing any agreement with France or with any European power that they said, let's make it universal. Let's have everybody sign it. And at that point, the French lost interest, because if everybody is saying that outlawing war, it doesn't do anything for France. It doesn't help them against Germany. So it was a very cynical activity, which people then took very seriously. And even today, there are prominent law professors at Yale writing glowingly about the Kellogg-Briand Pact. That Kellogg-Briand Pact is 1928. Hitler takes power in 1933. The Japanese invade Manchuria in 1931. It's hard to look at it as a successful accomplishment.
Who was Kellogg, and did he matter?
Frank Kellogg was a very mediocre Secretary of State for at that point, it was Coolidge, and I would say this was the only thing that he is associated with that anybody can remember, really. He was not there wasn't much foreign policy in those days, America was pretty much staying out of things.
We had a vice president back in those days that I assume a lot of people have never heard of, Dawes. There was a Dawes plan. Let's go back to what we were talking about earlier about the invasion of the Ruhr Valley in Germany. Who was Dawes? What did he do? What did it matter?
Yeah. Well, Dawes was a businessman, and in those years in the 1920s, because the United States government and public and Congress didn't want to be involved in Europe, but they did have economic interests in Europe. And after the Ruhr, they wanted to do something to sort of patch things up, including getting Germany to start paying reparations again so that the British and the French would pay the debt to the United States. And so what the government did at that time was look to businessmen and bankers private bankers acting in their private capacity to solve these problems. And that's what the Dawes Plan was, with sort of sotto voce backing with the U.S. government, but it really was a banker's plan. And what was it? It was to get private American bankers, chiefly Americans, to loan $250 million to Germany so that Germany could then pay the French and the British, so that the British and the French could then pay the Americans. And we created this sort of cyclical debt payment system, which only lasted a few years before it basically collapsed. And John Maynard Keynes at the time said, this isn't accomplishing anything, this is just moving paper around. But in the United States, it was a huge success. Everybody thought it was brilliant, and that's how Dawes got to be named vice president. It was regarded as being so successful. It really was not successful.
By the way, how much debt during those years that you wrote about, the 1900 to 1941, how much of that debt has been paid off by the French or by the Germans or by the Russians?
Well, they declared ultimately, when the Depression hit, the Europeans declared, well, first of all, Hoover declared a debt moratorium and then told them they didn't have to pay for a year. But they, at the Lausanne conference, said, well, we're not paying at all. Nobody's paying anybody anything. Forget about it. And that was pretty much it. The British, I think it's possible, however, that the British paid off their debt at some point, and I only looking at this period, so I don't really know how much more they had to keep paying afterwards. But I know that it was very upsetting to everybody that people were supposed to keep paying until 1988, which was a very long way off, given where the debt started in World War I.
Another gentleman that you write about, and people talk about Woodrow Wilson all the time. Historians, of course, talk about Henry Cabot Lodge. Who was he? How did he fit into this story? And how important was what he did?
He was vitally important and a very interesting character, because he and Theodore Roosevelt were the original sort of internationalists. They were the ones who thought America had to play an important role in the world. They were very, obviously, gung-ho about the Spanish-American War, but they wanted the United States to take responsibility for global affairs, commensurate with its growing power. And by the way, both Lodge and Roosevelt, before Wilson had even thought about a league, had themselves come up with the idea of a League of Nations. Roosevelt writes about it at great length in 1914, and Lodge is his buddy, and Lodge actually coined the term United Nations. However, that being said, when the Senate goes Republican in 1918, Lodge becomes both Senate Majority Leader and Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman. And his number one objective, as basically the Republican Party leader, is to make sure the Democrats don't win again in 1920, because it had been a Republican-dominated White House since the late 19th century. The election of Wilson was a complete fluke because Theodore Roosevelt decided to run as a third-party candidate, and so the Republicans lost for the first time. And the Republicans were so furious about this, they were desperate to get it back. So Lodge basically takes it upon himself. He knows two things. One, that if Wilson passes the League of Nations and the Versailles Treaty in Congress, it's going to be such a huge victory that it's probably going to catapult the Democrats into yet another victory, whether it's Wilson again in 1920 or somebody else. Therefore, Lodge knows he must defeat the League of Nations and the Versailles Treaty. And he makes it his business to do that. And because he's in charge of the Senate, he stacks the committees. He holds endless amounts of hearings. They read the Versailles Treaty out loud for 2 weeks. He buys time to try to build up opposition. And he's a brilliant legislative manipulator, and he winds up being able to defeat the League, which I think was probably the greatest error of the 20th century of anybody, and I think is very, very much responsible for World War II.
What part of this was an error? Defeating it?
Yes. Yeah.
Why? Why was that an error?
Because I think, as I say, at very little cost, and the League is not, one of the things that Lodge and the League opponents did was caricature the League, and there was the huge debate about Article 10, and whether Article 10 committed the United States to have to go to war anywhere in the world at any time if the League decided, other powers decided that, and the Republicans made a very big deal about how that would bind Americans to go to war, which was nonsense. There was nothing in Article 10 that you still had to have a declaration of war by Congress. The president still had to agree he wanted to go to war. But they were very successful in making that case. And they actually, I think they played on something that was real, which is Americans, did not want, if you put it a certain way, to be responsible for having to send troops anywhere in the world at any particular time. And so it was easy to sort of turn the Americans against that, and Lodge did that very effectively. And why was it a turning point? Because, as a result of that, the entire attitude of the American political system shifted toward the isolationists in the Republican Party, and therefore the United States just refused to take part at a time when the United States, as I say, had the greatest opportunity to establish a peace.
Henry Cabot Lodge and Woodrow Wilson both had PhDs. They went to Eastern schools. Johns Hopkins for Henry. No, it's Woodrow Wilson, I believe, got his PhD there. Why did they hate each other?
Well, a lot of people hated Woodrow Wilson. I mean, Woodrow Wilson was not the most, maybe his good friends enjoyed being with him, but he was a pretty cold guy and pretty arrogant, and he really he wasn't very generous to people he thought were fools, and he also rightly understood that Lodge was trying to destroy him. So in a way, I don't think he was wrong in his view of Lodge. Lodge, of course, being a very successful Senate politician, had an easier way with people. But if you want to ask me, the person who really hated Wilson was Theodore Roosevelt. I think Lodge hated him too, but in a way, it was them together. Why did Theodore Roosevelt hate Wilson? Some of it, of course, was he disagreed with Wilson ideologically, and Wilson was not, again, the most warm person in the world. But the Roosevelt really hated Wilson because he knew that he was responsible for putting Wilson in office. Roosevelt knew that he got Wilson elected. And so for him, it was very personal. And so this thing does become extremely personal with them. But in service of political ends. At the end of the day, if it had served Lodge's political purposes to pass the League, he would have passed the League. It's just that as it happened, it served his political purposes to defeat the League. And
explain why Theodore Roosevelt got Woodrow Wilson elected.
Well, again, in 1912, Roosevelt, he'd made a big mistake when he first took over from McKinley, which is the earlier part of our conversation, because he basically said, I'm going to treat this term as a term, even though he came in after a year's worth of McKinley's term. And so he finishes out that term, and then he runs for a second term, and then he basically has taken himself out because of the tradition of the president's not running for more than two. But being an ex-president was no fun for him. He really liked being president. He tried to distract himself by going off and killing something like 500 animals in Africa. But at the end of the day, he was young. He was a very young president, and so he was still very young, and he had a huge following in the country. People loved Theodore Roosevelt. And so he ran for president in 2012 against his own hand-picked President William Howard Taft, who he had put in the White House, and he ran against him, and therefore they wound up splitting the Republican vote in half and handing Wilson won with, I think, something like 40 plus, maybe 40%, 44% of the vote. Thank you. And so he wouldn't have won if Roosevelt hadn't.
And Roosevelt had 27% of the vote.
Right. No, and he came out ahead of Taft. He was one of the most popular politicians in the country at the time, so that's not surprising, except Republicans thought they should stick with the guy that they'd already elected.
One of the things that you point out is that it took 2/3 of the vote of the Senate to pass this treaty. What's your thinking about that? Is that the right percentage? Could it stay that way?
Well, the one thing that is clear is that the founders created a system that made it very hard to conduct foreign policy. I don't think, they thought they were doing their best, actually, because there was an improvement on the Articles of Confederation. But even so, the check that they gave to the Senate on treaties, and that's why when people say, why did the Senate defeat the Treaty of the League? I mean, in a way, it was because the Senate defeated any time the opposition party was in charge of the Senate, it was almost impossible to pass any treaty. Taft couldn't get various arbitration treaties with Britain passed because the Senate, that was the Senate's great power, was to defeat a treaty. So if you had the opposition party in charge, and in addition then insisted that there be 2/3 vote for approval, it was very hard to do.
Go back to 1938. Kristallnacht. Why is that important?
Yeah, one of the things that I discovered doing the research, because one of the questions that arises is, when did American public opinion begin to change about Europe and whether we should be doing anything about what's happening in Europe? Because in 1935 and 36, the country is very determined not to get involved in Europe. They passed the Neutrality Acts, which prevent the United States even from recognizing the existence of an aggressor by embargoing that, by putting sanctions on an aggressor. And so they wanted the United States to be completely neutral, not to trade with either side and not to embargo either side, to be completely out of it, which is because everybody believed that that's how the United States got pulled into World War I, because of its trading relationship with Britain. So they had passed the Neutrality Act, and Roosevelt himself, in his first term as president, ran as an isolationist. I mean, in 1936, it's not just that he says, I hate war. It's just he's running as an isolationist because that's what the American people are. So what is going to change their minds? Roosevelt begins to change his mind. I think he always was concerned, and he grew ever more concerned, but he was unable to move the public. Kristallnacht. So Kristallnacht, if the listeners, I'm sure, have some memory of this, it was probably the worst pogrom in modern Europe against the Jews in Germany. The Nazi Party, mostly organized, but partly just letting people run rampant, destroyed thousands of Jewish stores, ransacked thousands of Jewish homes. Jews were killed on the streets. Many Jews committed suicide because they lost everything in that one. And so it was a really horrific event. I'm sorry. And the interesting thing is that in the United States, Kristallnacht had a huge effect on American public opinion. Now, it's interesting because after Kristallnacht in 1938 in Germany, anti-Semitism and organized anti-Semitic groups in the United States grow enormously. Anti-Semitism goes up in the United States as a result of that. However, I would say the bulk of American opinion, and certainly people who think of themselves as Democrats and liberals in particular at that time, Roosevelt followers, were horrified at what had happened, and it put things in a different. It changed the optic of Germany, of Nazi Germany. People knew that Hitler was a problem on this issue, but people really had sort of very mixed feelings. Hitler had not emerged as the kind of evil figure in the same way that he later would. Kristallnacht was a turning point, more than Munich, which had happened a few months earlier. Americans had very ambivalent attitude towards Munich because it had kept the peace.
What do you mean by Munich?
Munich, I'm sorry, the agreement that that Hitler managed to get out of the British and French, essentially to allow Germany to take over Czechoslovakia without a fight. Hitler was threatening to take over parts of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, which was a heavily German section of Czechoslovakia, and he was threatening war, and ultimately Chamberlain, at the famous Neville Chamberlain meeting at Munich, where Chamberlain essentially said, you can take Czechoslovakia without a fight, in the hopes that this was the sort of the ultimate point of appeasement, in the hope that if Hitler got what he wanted in Czechoslovakia, then he would calm down and not go any further, which of course was immediately disproven. And so in the United States, Franklin Roosevelt publicly praised Munich, even though privately he treated it as a sellout of the Czechs and talked about Judas Iscariot and blood on hands and things like that. But Kristallnacht was not really had a huge effect on Americans feeling like we're not dealing with a civilized power here. We're dealing with a very strong power who are essentially barbarians, and that was frightening.
On the subject of the Jews, I want to go back to 1920. Henry Ford. He did a series of newspaper articles in a newspaper he owned in Dearborn, Michigan, called The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. 91 different editions. What in the world was Henry Ford up to and why?
Well, I mean, anti-Semitism is it's as old as almost Judaism and Christianity, but it certainly was always a vibrant in the United States.
What do you think? I know this is not easy to answer, but what do you think causes this? What is it and it happens here and still in this country out of nowhere, for no particular reason. You don't see anybody that's Jewish that's particularly making an impact.
Yeah, no, I don't. The origins of anti-Semitism and the human soul. I'm not. I can come up with the same answers that anybody comes up with. I mean, in Christian teaching, the Jews, betrayed Christ, and so they. I remember as a youth being told by other kids that I was, a Christ killer. I mean, so that
still exists, you think?
I don't know if it exists. People are more reticent in general. People are more reticent about saying things in public, but I don't know what they say in private.
What about Henry Ford? Why would he risk this?
Henry Ford was he was kind of a pacifist, and he may have also been an anti-Semite, but there's an interesting linkage here because after World War I, people who were disillusioned with why did the United States go to war and it was a big disaster and we should never have done it, they, as Americans are wont to do, they developed a conspiracy theory to explain how the United States had gone into this war when it shouldn't have. And the conspiracy theory revolved around bankers and munitions makers. So basically the theory was the arms industry, but also the banking industry, because of the war debts, got the United States into the war. And when you say banking industry to a lot of Americans, especially at that time, what they hear is Jews. And the idea that there's an international Jewish financial conspiracy to control the world is very old. And one of the things that Henry Ford reprinted in his Dearborn publication were the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a forgery designed to show that the Jews were actually trying to take over the world, etc. So I don't know how to explain why anti-Semitism is so virulent, but it is, and it certainly was then, and anti-Semitism plays a big part in responses in the 1930s to whether we should be doing something about Germany or not. And there are a lot of people who are accusing Roosevelt of basically going to the war to save Jews. They started calling this a Jewish war for Jews, World War II I'm talking about. And they would refer to Roosevelt as Rosenfeld, with the idea that he himself was either a Jew or taken over by Jews. It was a big part of the America First movement. America First movement was anti-Semitism. Charles Lindbergh gave a famous speech in 1941 in which he said, basically, the Jews are trying to take us to war.
Have you started writing Volume 3 yet?
I have not. I'm reading for it. I'm still looking for a way to write these books in less than 15 years, so I'm trying to see if I could structure my way into doing it faster.
What's a day like when you're in this kind of a situation?
A day is in this period, a day is about reading and taking notes. It's about reading and then reading secondary literature, meaning reading authors who've written about the period, and then looking at the authors that they cite and looking at the original material that they cite, and when necessary, going to that original material. So I'm in the process now of immersing myself in. Well, really, it's the World War II period, because the next book will begin during World War II.
How much of your day do you do this?
When I'm a good boy, I get up at 8 and do it until lunch, and then maybe get a couple more hours in the afternoon. If I'm writing, I can write for a few hours, but I can't write for more than 3 or 4 hours a day.
When do you think you'll begin writing?
My wife has told me I'm beginning writing in about a year, and I hope that that's right. I have other things I'm writing in the interim, so I've got a few things to get out of the way.
Father Kagan,
Yeah.
in the mix of all this, in the 30s, getting 30 million people to listen to him on a Sunday afternoon?
Yeah. It's
Who
almost
was
like
he?
Brian Lamb.
Yeah, close. Who was he?
Father Coughlin, he was known as the radio priest. He was an Irish Catholic radio personality who became increasingly, I would say he became a leading anti-Semitic voice in America because he also blamed World War I on the Jews and took this view that, after Kristallnacht, for instance, he said everybody's getting so upset about how many billions of dollars or millions of dollars the Jews had stolen from them, but who talks about how many millions of billions of dollars were stolen by Catholic and Christians under communism? And so he was a perfect example. Americans were divided in this period between those who feared communism the most and those who feared fascism the most. Conservatives tended to fear communism and be a little soft on fascism. Liberals tended to fear fascism and be a little soft on communism.
How do you define fascism?
That's a good question. It's a controversial question, but fascism is basically sort of the belief that one person holds all the wisdom and speaks for the people in general. That the voice of the people is expressed, and the interests of the people are protected by Il Duce, der Führer, the leader, and usually there's a sort of party aspect to it. In those days, people wore uniforms to indicate their membership. But you can have fascism without that. And I think sometimes I think we are dealing with a kind of fascism today in America. It just doesn't, people aren't saluting and wearing jackboots. But we do have a kind of Führer person that a certain number of Americans, I'm talking about Donald Trump, that certain Americans are willing to follow regardless of, who believe that he's right, no matter what he says.
How do you define communism?
Well, communism is an offshoot of the liberal enlightenment. One thing about fascism is that it's anti-liberal. It's fundamentally opposed to individual rights, whereas communism professes to be part of, in a way, the Enlightenment tradition, but believes that the only way to secure people's rights is by securing everyone an equal share in the means of production and in the economy, and have common ownership. And I think, whatever the ideals may be in practice, I think we've seen that really just becomes another tyranny, because you wind up having a party that is in control of everything presumably in the service of equalizing.
What, in your opinion, would have been different back in the first 40 years of the 20th century if there had been an internet?
I don't. That's a good question, and I remember before you would ask that question years ago. We used to talk about something called the CNN effect, which is basically what was the world like before you could see everything live on TV. And I think in that sense, I think we tend to overstate how much of a difference that made. People back in the 1890s, when they read about the Armenian genocide, for instance, the daily newspapers were full of it. In those days, you had a morning paper and an evening paper. They would have been full of it. People were responding in real time to those events, too, and there was a CNN effect before there was a CNN. The internet is interesting because, because of its lack of gatekeepers, so that everyone is able to express their opinion. So now we get to find out what everybody thinks about everything, and I think we're all horrified. Now that we know what everybody thinks, we almost wish we didn't know, right? So
I want to go over a number of names and get your take on them, because you do have an aside in there about Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. Those three men, presidents of the United States. What do you think of them?
Well, I think that you have to. For me, you have to separate. I have to separate whatever were doing domestically on domestic issues and what they were doing in foreign policy. Now, on domestic issues, I know there are people who are very fond of the economic policies at the time, and the country was certainly booming. Whether it was a result of their policies or just because the country was booming, I don't know. On social issues, they were pretty horrible. This was the period in which the most restrictive immigration legislation in history is passed. 1924 Immigration Act basically excludes everyone who's not from Northern Europe. So there's that. There's also the rise of the Klan in this period. The Ku Klux Klan enjoys a second life, which is much greater than its first life in this period. And also you have protectionist economic policies. So, I mean, from those point of view, I think it was all kind of a disaster. But in foreign policy, it's really a disaster because they were so wedded to the idea that the United States should not get involved in anything anywhere in the world that they basically sat by and allowed the world to collapse. And as I mentioned, also took part in helping the world collapse by their economic policies.
Some other names. You've mentioned them. Mussolini, Lenin, Stalin, and Hitler. Which of those four do you think had the biggest, I don't know what you call it.
Yeah, I know, really.
Disaster?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, I think you'd have to say Hitler, brought the world to the point of complete destruction, and not to mention killing 6 million Jews and millions of other victims of his Holocaust. So I suppose Hitler is special in that regard. But what they all have in common, and I think we need to think about the fact that their kind has not disappeared. What they all had in common was that they opposed liberal democracy as an ideological matter, not just because it didn't help them rule. I think, and sometimes I think we treat, Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini as sort of bizarre creatures that we could never imagine having to deal with again, except that now we are kind of dealing with them again. I mean, I don't really see, I'm going to say this, it may sound absurd, but, other than the Holocaust, I don't really see what the difference between Putin and Hitler is. Putin doesn't have a plan to exterminate a particular people, except now his plan is to exterminate Ukrainians. But in terms of his will, I don't think there's much that Putin is not willing to do to further his ends. And what he's doing in Ukraine right now is about as awful as anybody's ever done. And I think Xi Jinping is a new Mao. At least, and I think So it's good. It's useful for us to realize that the last bad people in the world are not behind us.
Well, it's time in this discussion to do what we always do. And haven't seen you for years, but to get out the Kagan family list. What's it like for you as a historian being married to the fourth ranking person in the State Department, Victoria Nuland?
Sorry, she's the third ranking person in the State Department.
Oh my goodness! What a mistake!
Oh my! It's
Tell
over.
her to change her Wikipedia.
It's over
site.
Between us. Is that what it says? Well, the Wikipedia. She's not in control of her Wikipedia page, I'm afraid. I have to say, getting to watch her in action has been one of the most amazing things in my life, honestly. I'm sorry, she's my wife, so I'm not gonna, people will have to take this whence it comes, but I think that she's an extraordinary diplomat, and the number of the number of balls she keeps in the air every day. I don't know how these people do it. So, and of course, I've always benefited enormously from being her husband in terms of my own work. The first book I wrote that got a fair amount of attention was a book called Paradise and Power, and I published it in 2003. That book was only a consequence of the fact that my wife Tori was ambassador to NATO, and I was just there as a trailing spouse, as they say. But I learned a lot in that. I traveled with her when she was posted to Moscow in 1991. We witnessed the coup and the overthrow of the communist regime there and the breakup of the Soviet Union. So it's been terrific for me.
You lost your dad in 2021.
Yeah, he was
Donald Kagan, professor at Yale.
Yeah, he was 89. I have to say, I mean, I miss him terribly, but he lived such a full and happy life. He got everything he wanted out of life and more than he even knew that he could get. So he put in a great 89 years and touched a lot of people because of his teaching over the many decades. And I miss him, but he really, really did have a wonderful life.
What's the story about the contributor to his seat there, where he got, the Bass grant. Yeah, what happened around that?
Oh well, I almost don't remember when that happened. Was it the 90s? I think it might have been the 90s. There was a Yale alumnus named Bass who wanted to donate. I think it was something like $20 million or more, maybe even, to set up a program to teach Western civilization at Yale. My father had redone and redesigned a program called Directed Studies, which is a intense focus on Western civilization, and they were going to now turn this into a larger program. And Yale was initially thrilled and accepted the money, but then there were a lot of complaints from sort of the left side of the political spectrum at Yale and people who were opposed to the teaching of Western civilization, and Yale actually gave back the money, which is something that I thought was unusual for a university to give back millions of dollars because they don't want to have a course on Western civilization. It was I think Yale never recovered from that decision to some extent.
You went to Yale.
Yeah.
But the other side of that story was Beverly Gage. You stepped out of a teaching situation at Yale because the pressure came from the other side.
What's the story on Beverly Gage? Because she was what was the issue?
Well, she would not. I mean, I don't want to I had her on the program here a few weeks ago, but she didn't want to be told by outsiders how to teach her class.
Oh, sure, right. By the people who were the funders of that program, right? No, I understand that. I understand her position on that. Yeah.
Fred Kagan,
my younger, smarter brother.
At the American Enterprise Institute.
Correct. Yeah. And right now, boy, he runs something with his wife Kim. They run something called the Critical Threats Project, and also something called the Institute for the Study of War. And they have basically have taken over, as far as I could tell, the analysis of the Ukraine war that the media uses. They produce the maps of what's going on in the battlefield. They produce reports on what's happening on the battlefield based on open source intelligence, if you will. It's really quite an extraordinary thing. And as I say, if you read stories in the New York Times and the Washington Post and elsewhere, many of them are based on the work that they do.
I'm not sure you're the one to ask about this, but if you look up the background on the Institute of the Study of War, it's funded by a lot of companies that make military hardware.
Yeah.
Does this, I mean, you hear there's money we're talking about through this whole process of, is it a problem? And in your case, you've been supported by a number of people like Phil Knight. Why Phil Knight?
Well, in my case, I'm supported by the people who support Brookings, and Phil Knight is one of the very generous
Smith
donors.
Richardson and
I once had This book was partly funded by a grant from Smith Richardson, which comes from the Vicks Vapor Rub fortune. If you're someone like myself, you can't really make money writing books, unfortunately. Much as I would like to be able to do that, you can't make a living that way anyway. And my wife works in the government, so somebody has to make some money around here. But thankfully, there are generous people who support think tanks like Brookings, who are willing to support my scholarship and that of others, and I'm very grateful for that. As far as you should talk to Fred and Kim about their own donors.
How much do all of you Kagans ever disagree?
We disagree plenty. I remember. We disagree plenty, but I think we agree. I think we agree on sort of like fundamental realities about the way the world works. That's our biggest area of agreement, and apparently we seem to disagree with much of the rest of the population.
Explain that, though. Give me.
Well, I just feel like I think we're very conscious of the role that power plays in international relations, and even though I think we also believe that ideology plays a big role, and for us, for me certainly, speaking for myself, it's the interaction of power and power and belief that is what makes the world go around, and that's not. I would say that's not the standard take. I think a lot of people look at the you have people like Steven Pinker writing about the progress of humanity, or Frank Fukuyama and the end of history, whereas I think we tend to be more, let's say, Hobbesian in our view that the world is always going to be about the clash of power and the clash of beliefs.
A trilogy, one book to go. The name of this book is The Ghost at the Feast. And I can't go past that without asking you what that means.
Yeah, no, the title comes from, there was a great British diplomat named Harold Nicolson, who, among other things, was present in 1919 at the Paris Peace Talks as part of the British delegation. And he wrote in his diary something like the following, which is that the fear that the American people would not live up to whatever Woodrow Wilson committed to at Paris was the ghost at all our feasts. And since that is in fact what happened, I decided to name the book about America being the ghost at the feast.
Last question. You have a title for your next book?
I don't. I have to see what it looks like first.
The Ghost at the Feast, America and the Collapse of World Order, 1900 to 1941. Thank you, Robert Kagan.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments? We would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.